ActionSA opposing litigation against the Political Party Funding Act. This is all going to become very important as we start hurtling to what is now an unknown date for the elections, but it is definitely next year. The background: My Vote Counts wants all donations disclosed and not just those above a certain threshold. Let's get the thoughts then of ActionSA and how they're going to be arguing this. Joining us is the party's national chairperson, Michael Beaumont, making time for me on the show this morning. Michael, good to have you with us. I want to get into the thresholds in a second. Just talk to me about this legal action. Why go this route?
Well, effectively, the South African political space is not an even playing field. You've got political parties who are represented in Parliament. I don't know if you know, Gareth, but 1.3 billion rand of your taxpayer funding is funding those political parties every single year. And effectively, emerging parties that are not yet in Parliament have to raise every cent privately. And we accept that that's the rules of the game, and we participate within that particular framework. But My Vote Counts now wants to go to court and say that every cent must be disclosed, whether it's 10 rand from a lady in the rural Eastern Cape or someone from Soweto. And effectively what we know from our experience in running a political party is that people are fearful of reprisal. They fear if their name is out there on a smaller donation, someone could actually come and hurt their business or investigate them, and people are legitimately afraid. What it does is it kills private funding for an emerging party like ActionSA. And enforces a system of incumbency.
Funding potentially fall away because of this possibility?
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you we have a huge amount of donors who donate below the threshold currently.
Which is 100,000 rand, I think.
Correct. Yeah. And they do so precisely because they don't want to be disclosed. Now, I mean, effectively, if you say that there's no disclosure limit at all, those donors stop donating altogether. And what you get in South Africa is a system of incumbency where political parties, even though they're being rejected by South Africans that are in Parliament, are going to remain there, and they're not going to be any outside competition because they can't compete with the 1.3 billion rand of taxpayer funding.
Because what you could end up with then is a situation where you could, as a party, I'm going to use ActionSA because you're here, you could potentially grow because of those financial contributions, but because somebody wants to remain anonymous, now they're rather not going to give you the money, they're going to stay out of the election cycle, essentially.
Well, absolutely. And effectively what you then have is an election campaign where the ANC and the EFF and the DA, are well funded. They have lots of posters, lots of rallies, lots of money being spent. And South Africans who need to hear about new alternatives to what is effectively a failed political establishment don't get to hear about those alternatives. But I'm also at pains to say, Gareth, that we aren't opposed to transparency. Our case itself makes various recommendations for what should be done for greater transparency, including kind of the equivalent of a lifestyle audit for political parties, because we seem to be the only party that is abiding by the current legislation and making our disclosures every quarter.
What about an option, and maybe this is part of the argument, I'm not sure if it is, so correct me, what about an option for any potential donors to not be made public? An option, you can opt out, I suppose, is maybe a way of looking at it.
Well, effectively there is such an option. It's provided for in the regulations. But the way it's written effectively is that such an exclusion would have to be for remarkable circumstances. And what you really see right now is political parties that just aren't disclosing. I mean, you had a political party that staged a rally at F&B Stadium, cost in the region of 60 or 70 million rand apparently, and no disclosures last quarter. None, not one.
Why do you think there is this discrepancy? Where's the issue? Where's the pinch point? Is it the wording? Is it the legislation? Is it, as tends to be in politics, the implementation?
Well, effectively what you've got is a scenario where parties that are willing to commit the crime of corruption, and let's be clear, in South Africa there are a lot of political parties that seem to be doing that, are taking the chance of a 15-year jail sentence. For such a political party, the regulations of the Party Funding Act is like jaywalking. It's a fine. Now, if
because there's so much money.
Well, correct. And if you are a political party that is law-abiding and obeys the rules, you take it very seriously. But I don't think parties that are funding their campaigns in bags of cash do it the same way.
So what are you hoping that this legislation, or this litigation is actually going to achieve? What's your ultimate outcome?
Well, we don't think that the disclosure limit should be reduced. We think it's a very sensible limit. Firstly, the IEC doesn't have capacity to go through what is effectively thousands of micro donations that political parties receive. And logically, let's be clear, Mrs. Kamala from Soweto and Mrs. Jones from the Eastern Cape aren't coming together to conspire with their 10 and 30 rand to buy ActionSA. Effectively, effectively 100,000 rand is a sensible amount of money because greater sums could buy influence, but lesser sums really aren't likely in the grand scheme of things. So we want to defeat this litigation, but we're also saying there needs to be audits of political parties' expenditure, the things that aren't going through the books, in other words. If you're having rallies at F&B Stadium and you don't have any disclosure, someone should be looking at that.
Who's the someone?
Well, effectively, that's part of what we say. There needs to be an enforcement unit within the IEC. These regulations basically require that there be investigations. But, the IEC is not an investigative unit. They're not set up for that. They have no culture in that kind of way of operating. And there needs to be a bit more professionalism in terms of how these regulations are actually enforced.
I feel a parliamentary committee in here somewhere. Another one.
No, most certainly not. I think, fortunately, for this particular occasion, is that the minister has the power to draft regulations and publish regulations that give effect to the Act. And they could create regulations that provide for these forms of investigative powers that are actually what's required, because there's various allegations in the public domain of parties that aren't abiding by the requirements. Major political parties didn't pass the minimum accounting standards in the last audit cycle, and there's no consequences. That has to change.
I wanted to take a step back, just for viewers who might not be aware of the context to how we got to this point. Why is it so important to know who is giving a political party the money? Clearly, it's someone who supports the ideals of the SNP, ActionSA, whoever it might be. Why is it so important? Why is that transparency needed?
Well, it arose from the Constitutional Court, and our Constitutional Court took a perspective to say that voters have the right to know how a political party is funded, and that such information is highly relevant to the political choices that are made by voters when they go to vote. And I think that's a very sound principle. We respect that principle. But I think in the purpose of drafting the legislation that flowed from that Constitutional Court judgment, a sensible discussion needed to take place to say, where's the threshold?
Yeah.
Where, after what amount of money does influence potentially become a problem, and below what amount of money is it not necessarily a problem? My vote counts saying that a R2 donation is going to buy a political party, I think is just being silly, and that's why we need to go and sort that out.
You agree with the 100,000 rand, though?
You think it's a sensible number?
Any idea where that number came from? I mean, which smart people came up with 100,000?
It's part of a research that went into the actual drafting of the legislation itself. But I think going back to the primary point here, Gareth, we've got to be clear. South Africans are fed up with their political establishment. New emerging parties are coming forward. To throttle those new emerging parties, and for that throttling to be done by the legislators in Parliament to their own advantage, is what we have to stop here. Now you've got
who are often members of those big parties already in Parliament, which is part
absolutely.
of the argument.
They draft legislation for themselves, and that's why 1.3 billion rand of your taxpayer funding goes to them, because they're the ones who draft the budget. But interestingly, and we posed this question to My Vote Counts because we've reached out, we're saying we think the principle of transparency is good. Can we work with you and help you do it the right way? And they appear to be willfully ignorant and not wanting to engage back. And just as an aside, interesting to see that they don't disclose their donations.
So, I was about to ask you, so how do we know that My Vote Counts is doing it above board as well? Because this is going to get thrown backwards and forwards. We're in election cycle, even though we don't have a date. This is going to become a football, really, between the political parties, the IEC, and My Vote Counts in this case. So back to the point then as well of who's going to be the adjudicator on this. Do we leave this again to the courts? Because then we're going to get the argument. You'll probably be back, other parties will be back saying the courts are interfering in the election cycle.
Not at all. The matter is before the Western Cape High Court. So My Vote Counts has filed their papers. We have now joined that application because just to prove how My Vote Counts has been clumsy about this process, they didn't even cite us in their papers. They didn't even have an understanding of how this would affect a party like ActionSA. We had to go to the Western Cape High Court yesterday and ask to be joined into the process as a respondent so that we can actually oppose this litigation, and that's effectively what we've had to do here.
Very briefly, as I say goodbye, will this, do you think, be determined by the courts before we get to next year's elections?
I think without any question it will be. I think whatever will arise from this litigation will require changes to the legislation. Hopefully the changes that we are proposing, which we think is sensible and grounded in transparency. But effectively, we know from our legislative cycles that it's going to take some time thereafter, and I doubt very much whether any of this will take effect before the election date next year.
Yeah, but